Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so I think we should get going. My name is David Hall, and as a trustee of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, I'd like to welcome you here today. As many of you will know, can you hear at the back? Only just. Is that better? As many of you will know, like that. Okay. As many of you will know, we're celebrating our bicentenary this year. And we thought for Heritage Open Days, we'd like to do something a bit different and have some samples of the sort of things we do mainly in the evening, during the daytime, and a bit shorter so that people wouldn't have to give up too much time to enjoy it. And we also wanted to have them free so that price wouldn't be any sort of barrier. So welcome. Can I just say we're not expecting to have a fire practice. So if the alarm goes, and I can't ever remember when it did, please out of the building and over the road into the square to stay out of the way of the fire brigade. Today's special event is free, but we are an educational charity and we don't get any government support or any council support for our running costs. So if any of you feel moved to make a donation in the donation box on the way out of the building, we'd be delighted. And if any of you feel moved to join the institution as a member, which would give you half price admission to our already modestly priced talks in the evenings, then again, we'd be delighted to welcome you. If any of you have been to this building before, you will know that we've been here since about 1930. Before that, we were on a building overlooking Parade Gardens, which was demolished for a road widening scheme, and there's information about that over there. And down below on the ground floor, many of you will already have seen a wonderful exhibition about our history and our collection, which is free for people to see. Now, today, the last of our special events, we are going to be looking to the future, the world in 2050. Our guide is Andreas Wasmuht. He has a deep knowledge of the business world and is also a philosopher. And he may tell you a bit about that as well. He's been an international business consultant working in blue chip organizations across many sectors, but he's also the convener of talks here about the world affairs, and he's a co-convener of our philosophy strand. So now let's see what Andreas has in his crystal ball. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. It's brilliant to see so many people here today who are interested in the future, and particularly so many young people at the back, all coming from the Wiltshire College, because it's you guys who are going to shape the future. You're going to be the leaders of the future in 2050. So no pressure on you, but I want to give you an insight as to what the world holds. I'm really pleased that we're doing this as part of Heritage Week, because heritage obviously implies a backward-looking gaze into the past, whereas this is obviously slightly different. This is going into the future, but in the near future. And the reason why 2050 we think is relevant is because parts of 2050 are already being built. They're already being created in societies, in business, etc. So, you know, we're not beginning here. 2050 is already happening, beginning to happen as we speak. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in 30 minutes has taken a lecture series by the same name of 8 lectures. So about 10 hours worth of stuff around what the world in 2050 will look like. So forgive me if I can only scratch the surface in half an hour, but it will hopefully give you a taster to dig deeper, because all of our talks are for free on our virtual BRLSI YouTube channel. So now Wiltshire College, for example, if you want to dig even deeper into what the world economy and business will look like in 2050, there is a lecture by Barrett Kupelian from PwC dedicated to just business and economics. I'll touch on it, but there will be other areas to look at today. Okay, so what will we be covering today? The journey into 2050 covers these different areas. So I'm going to be touching on the global economy and business. I'll be touching on what the societal trends are for the future and what it might look like in 2050. Obviously, I think nowadays you can't have a discussion about the future unless you actually also include the climate. That is one of the UN's global existential issues that we need to face and deal with. And it needs to be top of our minds. The next one is technology, and technology obviously is proceeding at a rapid rate. I don't know has everybody heard of Moore's law? Now, where basically the computing capacity doubles every 18 months. Now, I think if anything, Moore's law is actually being broken, and actually AI and quantum computing is going to get us into a completely different paradigm altogether. So, but I think we can expect huge changes in technology, and I think artificial intelligence is going to be one of those areas that we're going to focus on today. We then look at the global politics and governance of the world. Who's going to run the world? What do people think about cherished beliefs like democracy? Because it's not all clear at all that the current younger generations actually really have the same view of democracy as maybe some of the baby boomers and Generation X. And then finally, we just summarize things up. And hopefully, if you are interested, I'm happy to stay behind to answer some questions in the Q&A. Does that sound okay? Good. Right. So here we go. This is the first slide, which is about the global economy. Now, barring any global disasters, so we're talking a nuclear war, we're talking about climate events like Yellowstone, the super volcano exploding under Yellowstone and completely changing the climate. The assumption by PwC, this is a slide by PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, is that the world economy will more than double by 2050. I don't know how many of you know what the global economy size is at the moment. We're looking at a global economy of about $111 trillion. And the vast majority, not vast, but a fair chunk still to this date is led by the US. Now China, and this is the second bit, the second column there, who is going to be the makers and shakers in the world economy are already changing. So for example, China is imminently expected to overtake the US as the world's largest economy. And by 2050 is supposed to be accounting for $90 trillion of the world economy, which at that point will be roughly about $250 trillion in today's terms. So China is going to be a huge major player. It's going to be roughly about 1.4 times the size of the American economy by 2050. Another huge growth won't come from China. I mean, you already hear in the news that China is plateauing to some extent, as a vast majority of people have been taken into the middle class and have now become mass consumers. The future, actually, in the next 20 to 30 years, is predicted to come from some other countries. For example, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India, for example, but also and Indonesia is another country projected to grow rapidly. I mean, India, for example, economy is projected to increase tenfold to $34 trillion by 2050, which is roughly the same size of the percentage that the US economy is now. So I think huge changes coming up in the very soon foreseeable future. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that it's actually a shift, and this is the third column, drivers of growth. There is going to be a shift away to new technologies, but also a shift between East and West. By 2050, PricewaterhouseCoopers predict that actually the E7, so this is the Eastern 7 biggest countries, are going to be as big as the G7 are now. So it demonstrates there is definitely a shift from west to east economically, and that's something that we will need to take account of. Now, in terms of policy making, depending on how fast these eastern countries will grow, so I'm still talking about China, I'm talking about India, I'm talking about Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. That will obviously depend on the policies that they will adopt. Are they going to be adopting very closed autocratic frameworks, or are they going to be open to international trade and operate on a governance basis similar to that of China, for example? Now, all the indications are that those players I've just mentioned will do exactly that. So I would expect the major growth up to 2050 not to come in the West, but in the East. And that isn't just driven by the projected population increases, which we'll talk about in just a second, but also the rise of the consumer class in Asia. And it's going to follow similar trends to those of China at the moment. Good. Well, the industries of the future, obviously going to be looking at transport transformation. We're looking at energy transformation. How, these are the industries of the future, as well as AI, artificial intelligence, the movement of funds electronically through financial services. And these are the areas where there's going to be the biggest change. And the biggest change in industry is going to come that most of the wealth in the world by 2050 won't be generated by human beings, but by artificial intelligence. Okay, the final thing, I suppose, is it is up to the West to decide what role it wants to play in the future global economy, how it will access the Eastern new emerging financial empires like India and like Vietnam and Indonesia. There's some huge opportunities, but I think it's up to the West to really think about what value they can add to those economies. Because we're no longer in the old way of economies progressing. We're no longer into underdeveloped countries being primarily agriculture, and then you be industrialized to become the second sector, and then you go into tertiary sector of services, which includes AI and technology and everything else. Those countries, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, to some also Indonesia, they're already investing in all that kind of technology. So the West really needs to think long and hard, what can we sell meaningfully to those emerging economies? And one clear area, for example, would be financial services, intellectual properties, innovation, disruptor technologies, things like that. Okay, the only thing proviso with all of this is that currently on the economy side is debt, global debt will also rise significantly. Global debt currently runs about 2.6 of global GDP. So we're looking at about $250 trillion of debt in the world. That is projected to more than double to 500 trillion plus in 2050. And there's another issue to be considered. What happens when some of this debt with some of the largest Western economies no longer is serviceable? Will the deck of cards come down? That's the economy now. So the next slide I want to get to is society. Now, what I want to highlight before I even talk about this slide is that by now, hopefully, you will realize that all of this is connected. You can't really talk about the economy in isolation to society or the climate or politics or technology, because they're all intertwined. And I think that's the one message from this talk really, is that in order to shape a different future, which I think what this day is all about from Bath Spa University here, what the liberal arts can do to shape the world positively, we need to realize that all of this is interconnected. Right, onto society. When I gave a similar talk, some 15 years ago here at the BRLSI, talking about a different future. And we're looking at a UN projection of what the population might be like by the end of this century. at that point, so this is only 15 years ago, the assumption was that the population could rise, the global population could rise as high as 14 billion. When I wrote the book in 2011, we had just peaked at 7 billion. So the projection then was for the population to double. Now, obviously, here we are, some 14 years later, and we are just over 8 billion. So things are slowing down, which is good news. And the UN projections in terms of global population in the future is projected to turn out at about, peak at about 10 billion and then slowly decline as basically fertility replacement rates, which are currently about 2.5 children per family, are going to drop below 2.1, which would be the replacement ratio to actually have the world population growing. Now, obviously, the population will go up in certain areas more than others. And here's a slide that gives you an idea. So in 2023, on the left-hand bar there, we've just reached 8 billion people. The vast majority obviously live in Asia. And then you can see the makeup there that goes down into Africa and then Latin America and Europe, etc. Now, the 2050 projection is that we're more or less going to be at the peak of global population by 2050, reaching nearly 10 billion people. And the major growth rates, as you can see, are coming from Africa. They're coming from Oceania, so Australia, etc. And there's going to be some influx into North America, etc. And we'll talk about that in a second, because one of the biggest changes in population will be about birth rates, but it will also be about development of new technologies. So there are countries in the world which are suffering already in a decline in population. And that is predicted for most of Europe, Britain included. You've got to have Italy is particularly elderly. You've got other countries in Asia, like Japan, who are the eldest population on the planet, and they have issues. China is having problems because of the relaxation of the one-child family child policy. Only happened a few, 10 years ago or so. So they're also struggling, whereas other parts of the world are actually increasing in population. And here on the right-hand side, you can see roughly where that is. But by far, India is going to be the most populous country in the world in 2050 with nearly 1.7 billion people. And China is actually declining from a peak of 1.4 billion to about 1.3. But you can see Indonesia at 317 and Bangladesh are huge players. The reason why they're going to industrialize and economize much more than Pakistan is because of the way they're governed and the way they operate. Okay, the other thing briefly to mention is that the population isn't static across countries. So by 2050, the UN estimate is that we will have somewhere like 200 million migrants moving from country to country. Now, 143 million of these are climate migrants. We're going to move from sub-Saharan Africa from Southeast Asia and South Asia into other parts of the world because their part of the world is no longer sustainable to live in. So we're looking at 74 million people having to find other countries to live in. And that may be within their within their own continent, but it may well not be. Okay, and so the majority of these migrants, climate migrants, will actually come from South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. So plenty to think about. So the population isn't going to explode as we previously predicted. It's going to stabilize, but the climate in which they will live is going to be more challenging. And this is where we come to climate. I'm not sure whether you can see that in detail, but I'm going to talk you through it. So when I talked about the economy slide, this was all about PwC. When I talked about society, I talked about a consultancy predictions from Roland Berger Consultancy. This one is actually from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is their key slide in terms of what will happen in the climate if temperatures continue to rise. And they're looking at the dimensions of water, ecosystems, food, coast, health, and singular events. And I'm going to talk about that briefly. Now, all of this is to do with the projections in terms of rise in global temperatures. And the global temperature rise is measured against pre-industrial levels. So we're looking at about sort of 1800 or so. So at the moment, the Paris Agreement, one of the COP23, was that we need to stop temperatures rising above 1.5%, which is the vertical dotted line on the left-hand side there. And they're saying if we do that, we have a chance of actually not having a runaway greenhouse effect. But it will still have impacts. So we still have some water shortages. We'll still have some impact on ecosystems where some species will go extinct. There will be some impact on food. Some areas will have more food actually at the 1.5 level, the ones who are in the northern half of the globe, but other people will start to have less food availability. Likewise, as far as the coastline is concerned, the higher the temperature is going to go. At 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050 or 2100, the coastlines of the world will look relatively similar to what they look now. However, we already know that the temperature is unlikely to stay at 1.5% by the end of the century. The hottest year has been last year, so from July 23 to June 24, we already experienced temperatures at 1.5% above industrial levels. Now that doesn't mean it will continue because the average measurement is actually done over decades. But it seems to indicate that actually there's no way we're going to be at 1%. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is already saying 2% is the absolute minimum we can now probably expect. And actually, we're not certain we can deliver that because we haven't seen we haven't actually seen all of the effects from policies that government are committing to. I've been doing this since 1997. I've been following the climate. One of the first COPs, which was in Kyoto, where the governments of the world committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. And instead, this was over a 20-year period, and instead they rose by 20%. So there is clearly a bit of pessimism in the world and with scientists as to how much work is actually being done to limit climate change. So if we move further down to the right-hand side, then water shortages, ecosystem declines and extinction events for species, as well as rarity of food is going to be an issue. So the current estimate by the UN is that we roughly, by 2050, we need another 563 million hectares of arable land, which is roughly the same size as 3 times India, to feed the population. And the reason why we need that is not because the population is increasing massively in terms of numbers, but the expectations of the rising middle classes in Bangladesh, in India, in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia will want to consume more. So 3 times India is the land that we need by 2050 more to actually grow and harvest. At the same time, we're losing arable lands because of climate change. So there are some big lessons to be learned. There's other things that were covered in the various lectures about the world in 2050, including things like pollution. Now, I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but there is an area called the South Pacific Garbage Patch, right? Which is basically 1.3 trillion bits of plastic, which have all coalesced into this moving sea of doom. Oops. I might have to have Ollie back. No, okay. Thank you, it's a bit early. Ollie, can you come up and just help me with this? Let me see whether I can move this slide backwards. There we go. No. Bear with me. I just like it. There you go. Okay, so there's more work to be done to actually help us to address some of these issues. So far, we talked about the economy, the global economy. We talked about society. We talked about the climate. So let's move on to technology. So technology is, here's a bar chart of where we are currently and the kind of things that we can expect in the future. So in terms of, this is about artificial intelligence mainly and the growth of that. And we can expect quite a big change in terms of AI being able to do functions that we would only have previously thought humans can do. Most of you, have people in the room heard of the Turing test? The Turing test is there was a film called The Imitation Game with Turing. Now, the Turing test is actually, if you have a machine and a human in different rooms and you ask it questions from a third room and you can't tell the difference between the machine answers and the human answers, then the machine has passed the Turing test. Now, many argue already that we're already at that place with people like, you know, ChatGPT, things like that, and Gemini and Bard, etc. Lots of different AI systems. One of the predictions is that most of the futurologists, the AI experts, believe that by the end of this century, general AI will have happened. Now, general AI is very different to what we currently got. So narrow AI is the things that we get with ChatGPT. You know, you can get into ChatGPT and I'm sure you know this already from Wiltshire College, but you can get ChatGPT and other systems to actually write all your essays for you, right? And they're actually quite good, and most of them aren't even detected by the teachers. The problem with them is that if you then start having to put your citations in, your referencing, that's where it goes wrong. ChatGPT is not very good at accurate referencing. So teachers in the room, if you want to spot your students' essays having been written by ChatGPT, look at the referencing rather than the essay itself. But by the end of this century, what will have happened is that general AI will be around. So not just ChatGPT writing an essay, but actually artificial entities that will be able to do all the things that human beings can do. That is predicted by 50% of the futurologists to happen before the end of the century. But slightly closer to home, by 2026, AI will be able to write a high school or university essay. That's already happening to some extent, but obviously there are some flaws that I just mentioned. It will be in top of the pops. For those of you who still remember top of the pops, it will actually be purely AI-generated songs will already make it to the top of the charts. By 2028, which is only three and a bit years away, artificial intelligence will beat humans in a 5-kilometer race. And then by 2034, artificial intelligence will beat the world champion at Go, which has already happened. We already got that with AlphaGo has already beaten the world champion in Go already. But that was on the basis that AlphaGo has played millions and billions of games of Go to see how many permutations there are. What they're talking about here in 2034 is that AI will beat the world champion in Go, but only having played as many games as the world champion himself has played. So that is self-learning by artificial intelligence. And then by 2050, we will have our first New York Times bestseller produced purely on AI. And if you think that's a long way away, I think something like 50% of the news nowadays is already produced by AI rather than by human beings. Good. Okay, obviously, I'm not going to dwell on things like transhumanism and posthumanism today, but obviously, apart from AI, there will be technologies like CRISPR-Cas9, gene editing, etc. There will be a trend where there will be more interfaces being built between the human and the machine in the human body, which means there's, with this sort of cyber organization will increase. It's already happening to some extent, but that will be going further. One of the things which is less likely is transhumanism, in terms of actually thinking that you can embed your personality, your whole being, your whole essence in a machine. Now, Elon Musk is doing that at the moment with his Neuralink, and apparently he's looking for volunteers to be part of it, and good luck to him. From a philosophical point of view, there are some significant challenges to replicate yourself on a computer chip and roam freely on the internet. Okay, the final one on global governance is really a quick one, and that is not everybody is happy with democracy. Our most cherished belief that actually democracy is the way forward. Again, I don't know whether you know the author Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a very influential book in 1992 called The End of History. The Cold War had finished, right? The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Iron Curtain had come down, and he proclaimed that the liberal democratic economies had won the day, and there's no more progress now in future. This is the end state for the governance of the world. Whilst he was publishing the book, the Balkans melted down. Yugoslavia was breaking apart. Literally within 6 months of publishing the book, everything has gone pear-shaped again. So again, I just want to show you over the decades here, you can see the bar chart, people dissatisfied with democracy between 2005, so as little ago as 20 years ago, were 38% dissatisfied with democracy. We're now looking at about 57%. And then you see the countries on the middle bit there who are most dissatisfied. So the blue line is dissatisfaction with democracy, and the right-hand side is satisfaction with democracy. Now, this is a particular factor for the younger generations. Whenever we talk factor generations, Generation X and millennials in particular are dissatisfied with democracy. Now, why is that? Well, the answer seems to be, one is democracy doesn't seem to work for the majority of people. So if you look at the US, for example, who is supposed to be the beacon of democracy, is one of the highest countries of dissatisfaction with democracy, because democracy in the Western world has not been delivered equally. Now, the income and wealth inequalities in the most advanced economies in the world are very significant. It's measured by the Gini coefficient, and some of the countries are much more unequal than others. There's other areas though, so the younger generation in particular doesn't buy into what most democracies are. Most democracies are representative democracies, where we have MPs, etc., that represent us, rather than direct democracies where we vote as individuals. We have a say on all of the important issues in the world. Now, there are some direct democracies. Switzerland, for example, is a good example. And I'm sure people will groan at this, but they have loads of referenda every year. Now, for us in Britain, that would be absolutely terrible. Can you imagine having to go something similar to the UK referendum? You have to have that 6 to 8 times a year. And part of that, everybody's smiling, but it's true. But part of the problem is that we are actually just not so engaged in politics. We're very dissatisfied with politics, but we're not really engaged with it. So that's basically the 5 areas. And I now just want to summarize and then invite your questions. Second. Okay. As I already said, the reason why we chose 2050 is because part of 2050 is already happening. Yeah. So trends are in place today that will shape the future. And I'm looking at the back of the room again. Just imagine, I don't know how old you are, you're probably 17, 18 years old. So by the time you're 2050, you're going to be in your 40s. So you're going to be the business leaders of the future. You're going to be the politicians. You're going to be the economists. You're going to be the technocrats. you're going to be the disruptors. The question is, what kind of world will you have been bestowed, and what kind of world will you be creating? So what I'm saying is, everyone in this room has a contribution to make from now on to how 2050 is going to turn out. The prevailing zeitgeist points to some key future issues, which we talked about. Climate change is one, artificial intelligence is another, nuclear proliferation is another one. In terms of how democracy pans out across the world compared to autocracy, is going to be interesting in 2050. And also, the other aspect is that all of these factors are completely interrelated. So you need to look at them more like the network here on the slide. You can't look at the economy and business in isolation, because it will have impact on the climate, it will have impact on society. But one thing is clear is, that it is our role in life, ultimately, to bestow a better world on the future generation. And the major issues facing us in the coming decades are global and therefore require global cooperation. Having nationalistic thinking will not solve the problems of the world. And unfortunately, the political trend is the opposite. We're becoming far more binary opposed to each other. The election in America is a good example where Republicans can't even talk to Democrats. They have to have their own news channels, their own little echo chambers. Countries are becoming more radicalized and much more extreme, both on the right and on the left. And it's certainly happening across Europe. And there are issues that we need to grapple with. But the one thing I do want to leave you with at the very end is to say, it isn't just countries, it isn't just institutions like companies that have a role to play in this. It is actually us as individuals and also communities that will make a big difference to how 2050 will turn out. Thank you very much.
Andreas, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. Are you good for questions?
I'm good for questions if people want to stay.
If anybody needs to dash out, please do.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about your comment about global debt. What kind of debt is this? Government debt or personal debt? And if there's debt, it must be owed to somebody. So who are the creditors?
Yes, well, the creditors are typically institutions, right? And the money is owed by predominantly countries and institutions to other institutions. Now, that isn't a problem until these entities fail. So the banking crisis of 2007, 2008 is a good example. The banks were just too big to fail, because the financial system would have completely collapsed unless the banks, the governments would have come in to support that. Now, you've also seen that in a mini way in Greece, when they defaulted on their various loans, and obviously that has impacts. But the biggest factor is who's owed the money, right? Who's owed the money and how they would react if there's a default. So I think there's always going to be an excess of debt over income in the global economy, because that's how the global economy grows. But I think most commentators will say having 2.5 times the global debt to the GDP is very dangerous, because some very big entities could just collapse.
Thank you, Andreas. That was really, really interesting. I'm interested in the future of online misinformation and disinformation, and interested in your views about how you think that might develop, particularly looking at new technologies over the next 25 years or so, and maybe also a little bit about the impacts that might have on trust in government too.
So have impact on?
On trust in government too?
Yeah, well, very good question. And I think the fact is that, a bit like the rest of the talk on 2050, this kind of thing is already out here. We're already in a place where most official channels are no longer trusted by the younger generation. So newspapers, Newspapers used to be the go-to reference of information. By the younger generations, no longer trusted. Even BBC, no longer trusted by younger generations. The idea of even trusting experts was a huge issue during the recent pandemic. So I think there is currently a tendency where everybody seems to find their own echo chamber for news. And obviously the danger behind that is that once you start going into a news feed or area, and you look into this more and more deeply, the more of the same stuff will be fed to you. So there's this continuous confirmation bias reinforcement going on, and you end up in an echo chamber where you find it very difficult to actually trust information sources that seem to say something other than what you believe in. And I think that is interesting. And now we're running, BBC now runs BBC Verify to see whether things are true. And then, as soon as that starts, then somebody will say, well, who's verifying the verifiers? And then all of a sudden you come sort of a reductio absurdum, you go down. So I think the message, I suppose, for the future is it's not focus, don't focus so much on the past and the news feed of the day. Focus more on using critical reasoning skills to shape the world that you want.
Hi, I'm from Wiltshire College with our business students today. So I have to ask this question. What would be your advice to our young people who are sort of 16 to 18 on about how they navigate the future and how is it possible for them to make a contribution? Because it seems quite bewildering.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think one of the things, let me just try this. Oops. Right. Now, the answer is on the screen, right? So this is something that we run every year. We run a sixth form philosophy seminar of 6 weekly courses, which is interactive. So the reason why we do this is because this is for sixth formers aged 16 to 18, right? And the idea is that this is exactly the age where you become completely independent, right? You leave home, you go to university, you get a job, or you go to an apprenticeship. And the whole point is to actually give people a broader perspective on life than would have been given to them by their parents or the educational system so far, to give them a broader thinking, but also equip them with some critical reasoning skills to question things differently as they go to university or an apprenticeship, etc. So, I mean, again, here, we start off this year, for example, the first seminar is, who am I? So this is about personal identity. It's about who is there such a thing as me as an individual, or am I just a conglomeration of everybody I'm actually friends with, interact with? Then there's one about where's my mind? Third one is what is culture? The fourth one is there anybody out there? And then finally, what are my values and how do we shape a different future is the last one. So that would be my recommendation, but not obviously to come to the sixth form seminars necessarily, but I think for younger people today is think about the world that you want to live in and start from there. And realize that actually the world you want to live in isn't just about a particular lifestyle and a particular level of income. It's much broader than that. It's the kind of society you want to live in. It's the kind of climate you want to live in. It's the kind of freedom you want to be able to experience, whilst not reducing the freedom of other people. Those are the kind of things that I would encourage the young kids to think about, and not think about how much money am I going to be earning, what can I be able to afford, what kind of house should I buy, what kind of car should I have, what's the latest iPhone, that kind of thing. Those are the kind of things that actually are foisted upon us in consumerism. Right? So, and that's why critical reasoning skills are really important. Do I need to, is it okay to opt out, not having the latest mobile phone would be a good start. Yeah, and just think differently.
We have a question over here.
Okay, okay, thank you for your talk. I'm interested and a little concerned about your presentation of the statistics on the well, apparent according to the way that the survey was run, the lack of faith in democracy.
Yeah.
And really, I'd like to know how that was contextualized. I mean, lack of faith in a particular type of democracy or a particular way, presentation of a system of governments as democratic that might
Yeah.
not be a very functional type of democracy. And also, when you ask that kind of question, do you give people a choice of like, in comparison to an autocratic state in comparison?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Winston Churchill, but the one quote I like is that democracy is, what did he say? A terrible system, except for all the others that we've tried.
Yeah.
And so, you know, really, you've really got to unpack a statistic like that, especially when you're presenting it in the kind of context of, you know, it's not that people are necessarily cynical about the concept of democracy. It's the practice of it's how it's practiced. And it's like, do we actually see, like, do I have the choice to vote for somebody whose policies reflect my values?
Yeah.
And like, or are our politicians, like, do they reflect the values of a certain class of people? And do people, like, do young people have anybody who do their values show up in the politicians? And so I really find that, like, with that survey, I would really like to, and when you present that survey, I'd like to know, what do they want instead? Like, if we're demoralized about democracy, what do we want? Like, you know, because it actually is quite dangerous to say that. Because like a lot of people in response to that are offering things that are much worse. Like,
Shall we give Andreas a chance to respond?
Yeah, no, but I think, thank you for the impassioned question, because I think it's really relevant. So this is out of the Roland Berger compendium, which you can see and look at all the details around it. So I'm just replaying this, but I've got a certain view on this, right? So this was done as a study by Copenhagen University, looking at about 177 countries. And they categorized the countries into different niches. They categorized countries into closed autocracies, democratic autocracies, if that's just a thing, or electoral, let's call it electoral autocracies. And then you had liberal democracies, and you had electoral democracies. So those are the categorization. But the question of democracy was asked in the relevance to the country in question. So the vast majority of the people, the dissatisfieds, for example, on that list, on the blue line, were actually from representative democracy. And then you say, well, actually, that's dangerous to say that people are dissatisfied with democracies. They're dissatisfied not with the concept of a democracy, and the democracy is Greek, and means for the people, by the people, for the people. So what they are dissatisfied with, the younger generation, which I pointed out, is they're no longer satisfied that actually democracy works for their benefit. It doesn't work. Their representatives are not representative of them. Gesundheit. And they feel that they are not they're disenfranchised because they don't have direct access to democracy, as I described, through things like direct action and things like referenda, as happened, for example, in Switzerland. So I agree, Winston Churchill may well be right, but if it's the best of the worst, this is basically what he's saying, is there are still things we need to do to fix. There's another slide which I haven't shown in the presentation, which actually says how strongly people feel democracy needs to change, by how much. And the countries that are the most dissatisfied feel that democracy has to change the most to be relevant to them. So it's not kicking out democracy for autocracies. That's not the answer. But there is a realization and a need to look at how democracy is functioning, and also looking at the difference between democracy and capitalism, which nowadays are seen as more or less synonyms for each other.
We have a question here at the back.
Hello.
Hi,
What football team do you support?
pardon?
What football team do you support?
What football team? Bayern Munich.
Oh, that's very nice. Great team.
Which do you support?
Pardon?
Which team do you support?
Oh, Borussia Dortmund.
Do you? Okay, are you sad that Fulkrug is gone?
Not really. Didn't really have much teeth.
Okay.
It all boils down to football.
Yes. Well,
Are there any other questions, or shall we wind up? It was supposed to be a half-hour session. Obviously, there's been a lot of interest, and Andreas has had us all gripped. So can we just say thank you to Andreas and
thank you.
and I hope those of you who are here for the first time might think of coming back for some of our other activities. Thank you. Bye.